And she said to me, she said, "That's weird. Could they be reading my emails? That's creepy." To recognize these God-given rights, that rights come from God, not from government. I don't want to be an enemy of the surveillance state unless I understand that the surveillance state is already my enemy. It's already the enemy of the people. It's already the enemy of liberty.
All right, I'd like to welcome to everyone to the podcast, And If Love Remains. And I am just absolutely privileged and honored to have C. Mitchell Shaw with us today on the show. Mitch has become a fast friend of mine. I think we just met, a month or two ago, I think? And
yeah, this is just about 2 months.
Just about 2 months. And it's just been a great talking to Mitch, and he's a fascinating guy. I think you're going to love hearing from him. He is the host of Enemy of Surveillance podcast. You can find that anywhere you find your podcast. His enemyofsurveillance.com. Is it .podbean.com? Is that right?
So it's enemyofsurveillance.podbean.com, and it's the Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. Enemy
of the Surveillance State podcast. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. In fact, this let me ask you this, Mitch, and we're gonna dive deep a little bit into your story. But why should people be worried about the surveillance state that we're in right now? Why should people even have that on their mind right now? What's something that people should think about?
No one ever asks me that question. That is the question, because it's normally phrased like this, Mike. It's normally phrased, "Hey, as long as I don't have anything to hide, why should I care?"
Right.
And my answer is, and I stole this from a guy named Todd Weaver that runs a company that builds laptops and now a phone that are geared toward protecting your privacy. His answer, and I loved it, is it's never about what you have to hide. It is always about what you have to protect. And the analogy that I use, so you come up to your front door, you've been out doing some grocery shopping, right? You come up to your front door, you're loaded down with bags of groceries, and now you've got to fish around and juggle groceries, maybe put some stuff down on the porch or whatever, fish out your car key or your house key, unlock your front door, and now pick up groceries and get back into the house. And you got to go back and kind of close the door and lock it again. Wouldn't it be easier just to leave the door unlocked? Right? I mean, that would be so much simpler. But you will never do that. You will never leave your house unattended without the door locked. Why? Because you've got stuff in there that's worth protecting. You're not hiding anything. You just got some stuff to protect, right? You've got, and in the digital space, it's really not any different than that. So maybe
right. What are some of the things that we need to protect in the digital space?
Okay, so I would say our identities, our ideas, our wives and children, our husbands, our loved ones. We need. So, as a husband and a father, this is a big deal to me because I try. I'm not perfect. I don't walk on water or anything like that. Sometimes my ankles get wet when I try. But I try to think in terms of, as a husband and a father, what am I called to do in any given situation that's presented to me, right? If it's like, where are we going to live? What job am I going to take? How am I going to handle this situation or that situation? As a husband and a father, I have to take my wife and children into account. In fact, before myself. They should matter to me more than I matter to me. And if you feel differently about that, you're probably wrong about other things too. Maybe by way of analogy, this would be a good way of explaining it. So I remember years ago, my wife had, we were just having a conversation about you guys remember, do you remember the old department store Rose's? When there were Rose's department stores everywhere?
Sure, yeah.
I don't know if you had those out there, but they were like, man, it was like, there was, Walmart, Kmart, Rose's. Those are like the three big box stores. And then Rose's just dried up and blew away. So my wife was curious as to whether there were any Rose's stores anywhere around anymore. So she did an internet search for Rose's. No, she was emailing a friend. That's what it was. She was emailing a friend, and she mentioned the time when they had been to Rose's years before, right? And then that was that.
Right.
So then, like 2 days later, all of her ads on the right hand side of her computer screen were for florists and deals on roses.
Wow.
And she said to me, that's weird. Could they be reading my emails? And I was like, well, you use Gmail, so yeah.
Right.
And she said, that's creepy.
It is.
And you know what, Mike? It is creepy. It is creepy that now, let me be clear. A human being is not sitting there parsing through her emails. They have a computer that runs an algorithm, a math program that sorts that out by keywords and tries to figure out what that means. And it's not perfect. That's why they didn't know she was talking about Rose's department store. So they thought she was talking about roses. But nonetheless, they latched onto what they saw as a marketable keyword. And you go, oh, big deal. So she saw ads for flowers. That doesn't really infringe on anyone's privacy. Well, what if you have to Google an embarrassing medical question? What if you have to ask about a rash or an itch in a weird place? And then 3 days later, you start seeing those ads. Here's what that means. That means that Google, the people at Google now have access to the question that you asked and this weird medical situation you've got going on. It means that all of their advertisers that buy that information from them so that they can pump ads to you know that. And that's weird. That's just weird.
Just creepy.
And sometimes it could be, it is. And sometimes it can be way worse than just weird or creepy. So in my podcast, Enemy of the Surveillance State, the very first episode, I dealt with this question, why surveillance matters, even if you think you have nothing to hide. And I played a couple of sound clips in that. One was from Ed Snowden's interview with, now I don't remember the journalist, but this is the guy that traveled out to Russia to meet Ed Snowden. It was his first real interview post his banishment.
Uh-huh.
And he mentioned that if you're doing something live on the web, so you're creating a Google document, you're using Gmail, so that's actually a web-based email service. You're not creating that email on your computer. Your computer is being treated essentially as a workstation connected directly to Google's servers, and what you are typing directly into Google's servers. So it is not just that they see the finished product. Here's what happens. You're typing out an email, and you don't really like the last clause that you typed, so you pause for, say, 3.2 seconds, and then you backspace over that clause, and you pause for 1.6 seconds, and then you type a new clause. They don't just see the finished product. They actually have a record of that entire timeline that their computers can tag later, and at any point forever now, because that is part of this permanent record. It exists in perpetuity. Someone can go back and pull that up and look at you. Actually, they can see the data stream of you typing that in and using psychological profiling techniques. They don't just know what you wrote, Mike. They know what you were thinking when you wrote it.
So
an invasion into your actual mind.
That's wild. I never thought of it that way of having my computer, which I, theoretically own, and having it literally be nothing more than a terminal into a larger database that I'm just contributing to on a daily, hourly, minutely basis.
Oh, yeah. So when you think about the word internet, we use that word so much that it's like all these other words, they sort of lose their meaning, which is why people use web and internet interchangeably. And I won't get into the nuts and bolts, but the web is one thing and the internet is something else. And the easiest way to explain that is the internet is hardware and the web is software. So the web is sites that are built on top of the internet. So
okay.
The internet, let's pick that word apart for a moment. Internet. It is a network of networks. It is an internetwork, right? And your computer, if you're online right now, is part of that. Now, does that mean that you're hosting a web page? No. But does it mean that if somebody really knows what they're doing, they could get into your computer? It means that, yes, it does. Because you are part of that network of networks if you're connected. You're not just accessing it, you're plugged into it. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not anti-tech. I was that guy that in the 1980s, when everybody got a digital watch for Christmas, you remember that, Mike?
Sure.
Everybody that year got a digital watch.
The big black beast.
Yeah, and some of them had video games on them, like you might have Pac-Man on it,
right.
or Galaga. You remember that? So that year after Christmas break, I was the kid standing in line in the playground with a queue of kids in front of me handing me their phones, and I'm setting their phones up, or their watches, I'm sorry. They're handing me their watches, and I'm setting them up and handing them back to them because I've just always been that guy. I'd come over to your house, and you've had your VCR for a year and a half, and it's still flashing 12, right? So you can't record Days of Our Lives or General Hospital while
you've
you're
been to my house
last
week
anyway. Right. So you've still got a VCR with it, dude. I bet you have a fax machine too.
I'm old school.
So they've still got that fax. Every now and again, I'll get this thing where it's like you've got a document that you got to send to somebody. And they're like, "Can you fax that to me?" I'm like, "Well, why don't I send it by Pony Express?"
Right.
Fax? Are you kidding? Fax? Is this 1873? Are you insane?
Right.
Why can't I just email this to you? Wow. I'll take a picture of it and text it to you. How about that?
There you go.
So you can't record Days of Our Lives or General Hospital. You shouldn't have been anyway, but worse than that, you couldn't because your clock wasn't set.
Right.
So I'd set your clock up for you and leave, and then unless you get a power outage, you're good to go. Power outage, I'd have like 6 people call me, "Man, can you come over?" "Yeah, I'm on my way." I've always been that guy, so I love technology. I really do, but I recognize that it's sort of like electricity. If you use it well, it is your friend. And if you don't know what you're doing, you're about to get your shoes knocked off. It's going to do some damage.
Yeah.
It's going to put a mark on you that Ajax won't take off.
It really is sobering
we have
to think about it in those terms as a tool, as a very extremely sharp tool that we're wielding around unknowingly, knowing what the damage we can do.
So an analogy I like to use is that tools are amoral, right? Like let's take an axe. Whether you've ever used an axe or not, you've seen an axe and you know what it's for. An axe, if you use it to chop firewood for your grandmother, is a good tool. If you use it to chop your grandmother, it is a bad tool.
Yeah.
But the axe itself is neither good nor bad. It's all about how it's being used. It's about the motivations of the people using it. By the way, if you're chopping firewood for your grandmother with an axe and you're 6 years old, it's a bad tool. You have no business wielding that. You're going to chop your foot off.
Right.
Okay. So it really is not just about your motives, but it's also about, like, do you know what you're doing? Should you even be doing this?
Sure.
It's like, firearms. I worked in a store many, many years ago, and one of the things that we sold, amongst other things, was firearms. And this guy brought his wife, and he was taking a new job. He was going to be traveling a bunch, so he wanted her to get a gun for the house, and she was really, really nervous about it. And I took him off to the side, and I said, "Man, do you own guns?" He said, "I do." I said, "Take her out to the range. Come back and see me in 6 months. Get her used to a gun. Do not buy this woman a gun. She doesn't know what she's doing. She doesn't want to know what she's doing. And it's going to be super dangerous for her to own a gun." And so he left. I didn't even try to sell him a gun. Not that I'm not anti-gun. I'm very pro Second Amendment. I'm very pro firearm ownership, the right to keep and bear arms, all of that. But there are people that, just because of who they are and their level of comfort with that or their level of expertise with that, just don't need to handle guns. And technology can be that same way. So one of the analogies that I use, and it's why I use guns as sort of a step into that. The Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary, et cetera, right?
Right.
So a well-regulated militia. These are people that got together on a regular basis and trained in the use of their arms, and they trained in the use of using their arms together as a unit, as a cohesive unit. The problem that we have with technology is that most people will say something like, "Well, man, I don't even understand technology, so I don't know what I'm doing." But there are web forums out there. There are sites that you can visit that will instruct you and help you to better understand this and get you to a place where you are part of that well-regulated militia of the enemies of the surveillance state. Because getting back to why that even matters, because I don't want to be an enemy of the surveillance state unless I understand that the surveillance state is already my enemy.
Right.
Already the enemy of the people. It's already the enemy of liberty. What we used to call liberty, we now have to chop up into pieces and talk about those component parts. And one of those component parts is privacy. I have the right to communicate without anyone else listening to, reading, or harvesting that communication. That is my right. And if I don't have that right, I can't really say I'm free. So, So one more point to sort of answer you, and this one was a real shocker for a lot of my listeners. I heard back from people about this one. That second sound clip that I played in that first episode, and I would recommend your listeners, if they're interested at all, just go to that podcast. It's enemyofsurveillance.podbean.com or wherever you find your podcast. Enemy of the Surveillance State. Just do a search, you'll find it. And listen to the very first episode, Why Surveillance Matters Even If You Have Nothing to Hide. That second sound clip was from a Kansas City news broadcast where here's what they did. They gave a female staffer a new smartphone, and they didn't tell her what they were going to do. They just gave her the smartphone and told her, take it home and use it. We'll bring it back in a couple of weeks, and we're gonna do a story on this. And maybe she thought they were just doing like a story on really new cutting edge technology or whatever, right?
Right.
But they bring in the security expert, and she's taking pictures of her daughter, who's like 3 or 4 years old. I think her daughter's name is Lindsay. And so she's taking pictures of her daughter, like, tucking her into bed at night and playing at the park and blah, blah, blah. And then here's what they do. This guy, she posts these pictures to Facebook, right? But what she doesn't realize is that her phone geotagged those pictures. So what that means is it inserts into the metadata of the picture the geographic coordinates, the GPS coordinates for where that picture was taken. That's called EXIF data, EXIF. And every digital camera has EXIF data. If that digital camera is on a smartphone, that EXIF data can include location information unless you deliberately turned that off, right? She had not, but it's turned on. So he goes to her Facebook page and downloads the picture, not using any special software or anything. He just looks at the properties of the picture, and there's the EXIF data. He opens that up in a map and shows her those coordinates. And here's the deal. So here's the park where her daughter plays.
Right.
Here's the part of the park where her daughter plays. And then by looking at the timestamps of these pictures, he's able to see that all of these pictures take place on, and I don't remember the exact day, but I'll just say they're all on Tuesday. And they're all between 1 and 3:30. So and because the little girl was wearing different clothes in some of the pictures, he knows this is spread out over a series of Tuesdays. And he's looking at the timestamps, and sure enough, that confirms it. So here's what he could do. If he's a bad actor, here's what he knows. He knows that every Tuesday between 1 and 2:30 or 1 and 3:30, that mother is going to have her 3-year-old daughter at that park, at that location, playing on that play set. All he has to do is distract her for a moment, and she will never see her daughter again. Then he shows her the pictures of her daughter in her room getting ready for bed.
Oh.
He zooms in. Here's your house. Here's the corner of the house that is your daughter's bedroom. Now, as a husband and a father, that says to me, turn off the location information on your phone. You probably don't need it. You don't need it for cameras. The only reason you will ever need to geotag a photo is if you've been in an automobile accident and you're taking a picture of it right here, right now, where this guy just clipped my bumper, and I may need this for the courtroom. Turn on the location information, take that picture, turn it back off. You never need it for any other reason.
Right.
It's not cool to be able to tag photos with geolocations, checking into locations. There was a story, I don't know, early on in the whole social media thing. 16-year-old girl was off, this was in Texas. She was off on her shift to what was the name of that ice cream shop where she worked? It doesn't matter, like a Brahms or something like that.
Okay, Baskin Robbins type thing.
Right. So she posts on social media, hey, headed off to work at Brahms. Anybody interested, come in and hit me up. No big deal. Simple, innocent post. She was never seen again. Because here's what happened. The guy that had been stalking her profile knew where she lived because her address was part of her profile. He knew where she worked because the address of her job was part of her profile. He knew the only route she could take to get there, and now he knew her schedule. He just intercepted her along the way.
Wow.
This is why it matters. This is why privacy matters, because we have things that are worth protecting: our lives, our liberty, our property.
Well, and we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. I want to also dig a little bit into your story and what got you interested in this particular. We're talking to C. Mitchell Shaw. He is the host of Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast, which just Google it, wherever you get your podcast, you can find Enemy of the Surveillance State. And we're going to take just a quick break, and then we'll be right back. This episode of And If Love Remains is brought to you by Music by Mike, Love by You, your source for custom music. Do you have a wedding coming up? Maybe an anniversary? Or maybe you're starting a podcast? The best source for your custom music is you don't want off-the-shelf music for those type of events. You want custom music. Go check out at Facebook, Music by Mike, Love by You. See what they can do for you. All right, we're back. This is And If Love Remains. It's a podcast talking about interesting people, interesting ideas, interesting interests. And my guest today is C. Mitchell Shaw, the host of Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. Just very excited to have him again. Mitch, we've got to know each other a little bit, and I'd love for the people to know your story. How did you... I know that you were a writer for the New Republic. I know you've done different things in broadcasting before. What got you so interested in technology? And specifically, let's just back up. I want to hear more about Mitch.
Okay. So first, like I said earlier, I've just always had an interest in technology. I've always taken things apart and put them back together again. When I was like 8 years old, I had this Batman alarm clock that, the alarm, you'd hear tires screeching on the Batmobile, and then Robin would say something like, "Holy smoke, Batman, it's time to get up." It was goofy, but I was 8. I wanted to know how it did that. So I took it apart and saw the pieces, and there was this little disc in there and so I put it all back together, and then I hit the alarm button. It sounded, like I was listening to Black Sabbath backward or something. It was what? I was like, oh, I think I did something wrong.
Right.
So I took it apart, flipped the disc around, put it back together, and then holy smoke, Batman! I was like, oh, and now I know how that works, and I'm happy. So I've just always kind of been a nerd, right? The two phrases that stand out from my childhood are shows potential, but fails to apply himself. That was at the bottom of every report card I ever brought home. And no fair, we had him last time, you take him this time. When they picked for team sports, right? So the fat kid with braces on his legs and asthma got picked right before I did. So I've always been kind of a nerd. Of course, I was the rock and roll rebel and all of that stuff because it was the 80s and you had to do that. But right. I've just always really, really been kind of geared toward what's behind things, reading and things like that. So raised in a very non-religious home. The only time God was mentioned in our house is as a curse word, or as just sort of an expression like, well, the good Lord knows or something like that. But there was never any, I had no religious upbringing whatsoever.
God bless him as a pejorative.
Yeah. Well, God bless your heart.
Right.
Which in the South, if you're not from the South, that does not mean God bless your heart. Bless your heart in the South is the ugliest thing you can say about somebody usually. It means, oh my, but you're stupid.
Right.
I'm sort of the white sheep of my family, I guess. I was raised in a broken home and in the finer trailer parks and government housing complexes all across the southeastern United States. But when I was 16 years old, I became a Christian, a Protestant Christian. And began attending church and little by little began to take that more and more seriously. Went away to Bible college. I was going to be a minister. Met my now wife there. She was up visiting some friends at that particular area. We were part of the same denomination at the time. And there was a big church conference, and she came up for that. So we got married. Flash forward a couple of years, we get married, and then the children started coming almost immediately. And I had never really even thought about politics. I had some sort of philosophical political ideas, but I remember not knowing the difference at 18 years old between a Democrat and a Republican. And I like to say I've come full circle. I went from not knowing the difference between a Democrat and a Republican, let me be clear, the party, okay?
Right.
The Democrat Party and the Republican Party, to recognizing the differences between the parties and their platforms, to then finally recognizing that at the leadership of both of those parties, I was right to begin with. There's not a difference. Sadly, their platforms are very different, and the average voter is very, very different. But in the parties, there's really not. Sadly, in the leadership of the parties, there's not that much difference when it comes to constitutionalism and actually abiding by the God-given principles that are enumerated in the Constitution, these rights that God has given to us that we codified with the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, non-religious, and now at 16 years old, I'm attending church on a regular basis. I've gone away to Bible college. I've met my wife. We've got married. The babies start coming. And when my son, my oldest son, who's now 28 years old, when he was born, and I looked at him for the first time, I realized, like, I'm not just going to die when I die. I'm leaving something here, right? That's going to leave something here, that's going to leave something here, that's going to leave something here. Like, I'm part of, and that means I didn't just start when I started either, by the way. And so just because I came from someone who came from someone who came from someone. So I'm now part of this line. And I'd never thought about that. But
I'm going to interrupt just a second. Do you think that huge change of mind, do you think a lot of that came because of your upbringing? In other words, because you were kind of in a broken home and you'd come from a place that wasn't ideal, that seeing this as a chain of events really struck you harder than most? Do you suspect?
Yeah, I do, because I had never thought about it, and it wasn't something that was ever talked about. And now, so this is like I've just discovered that water is wet, and I'm like, hey, y'all, water's wet. Well, of course, yeah, we knew that. Well, I didn't.
Well,
it's like really like this.
And I asked
this is a big aha moment for me.
Right. And I asked that not because that's an obvious thing, because I don't think it is obvious. I don't think people think about that. And I think it became more acute to you because of the realization, the stark differences of what you wanted versus what was.
Yeah. And it all happened because now let me, I guess one thing I should say is that my wife and I got married very young. I was 20 and she was 19. I say that we grew up together. We just did it after we got married.
Right.
And that's very, very true. Like, my tongue's not even in my cheek. We grew up as a married couple. Like, we came into full adulthood as a married couple with children. And kids don't come with an instruction manual. Like, like everything else, you can just, like, nowadays, you just download the PDF, from the website and you're good to go.
Right.
Kids aren't like that. It's, so I'm looking at this pink little boy that is my son. Like, I have a son, and I knew, like, she was pregnant, and we'd done the ultrasound. We knew we were having a little boy, and we'd already named him, and I'm talking to him in utero and all of that. But now I'm holding him like he's here, and the realization of it just really weighed on me, not in a negative way. I don't mean like, oh, what a burden. I mean, like, it was really like just the gravity of being a father.
Yeah.
And then that's when I realized, like I say, if this line goes forward, because I've had a child now, I'm not just going to die when I die, right? I'm leaving someone here.
Right.
And then he's going to have children, hopefully, and they'll leave someone here, and then they'll leave someone here. And then, so if that line goes forward, that means it also goes backward. It means I'm not just here. Like, I mean, I get God made me. I was already, like I say, a Christian at this point. But it's more than that. It's that, like, there's been a mechanism in place for me to be here. And that mechanism was my parents, and then their parents before them, and then their parents before them, and on back and back and back. And so I've actually looked and, like, sadly today, heritage, outside of a handful of selected groups that are allowed to be proud of their heritage just isn't even a big deal to most people anymore. And I think that's really sad, because when I dug back, what I found out is that the Shaws are Irish, which explains a lot of things about me.
Uh-huh.
But we are not just Irish. We are Scotch-Irish, meaning that, so there was this period in Irish history when the solution to the, quote, Irish problem was to get rid of the Irish, right? Like, Ireland is great, but it's populated by those darned Irish. So say what we're going to do, we're going to take the land away from them, and we're going to make these land grants to Scots who are willing to go over there and populate the island. And then, of course, we'll water down the line, and, there'll be less Irish and more Scotch, and, we'll finally get to where we want to be. But what they didn't take into account, so my people were part of the Macintosh plan of the Scots who went over to Ireland, and then we went native. We were like, hey, these redhead girls, they're pretty, and I like the green, and I like the blue sea, and, I love Ireland. And so we just became Irish, and it really kind of backfired on the masters, so to speak. So, but going back to Scotland, then, my people at Scotland, the Macintosh plan stood beside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn, telling the English that was too far back then. Right? Now, Braveheart is about as historically accurate as any other made by Hollywood movie of that era. It's
right.
not.
But
the point is, there really was a Robert the Bruce, and there really was a battle at Bannockburn, and I was in someone's loins at Bannockburn. I was there in a very real sense. Genetically,
right.
I was there. And that hit me, and that was kind of a big deal. So then moving forward, we continued to have children, and my wife chose, we chose to homeschool initially, and then we were going to put them in public school, and then we didn't, because I remember that day when, my oldest son was, he's 6 years old, and, we were actually at the grocery store, or the department store, picking out all the things for his school list that we'd gotten from the school, because we registered him, and they, here are all the things he needs this first day. So we're, crayons and a pencil box, and I stopped in the middle of the aisle, and my wife looked at me and said, "What?" And I said, "Lisa, I can't do this." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, I can't give them my only son. I can't do this. I don't have time at the end of every day to stop and deprogram whatever they've put into him. I won't know what questions to ask. I will miss something somewhere. And I don't know them. They're not accountable to me. And I can't do this. And she said, "Well, what other option do we have?" I said, "Well, you homeschooling through kindergarten, you can do this." And she said, I don't know that I'm qualified. And I said, "Hey, you taught him to use the bathroom by himself. You taught him to eat with a fork without poking his eye out. I think you can do this."
Right.
And so she did. She homeschooled all of our kids all the way through. Our youngest now is only 8, so I wouldn't say all the way through, but that's our plan still.
Right.
Now, in the interim, we converted to Catholicism, and not just Catholicism, but traditional Latin Mass Catholicism, the way the Mass was done for 1,400 years before the Second Vatican Council. And the reason I mention all of these things about sort of my religious background and everything is not to proselytize your listeners. This isn't the place for that, but just to say that's a huge part of who I am, right? Like I came to recognize these God-given rights.
Right.
That rights come from God, not from government. Because if government give us, government can take us away. And that's why people talk about, you will never hear me use the phrase Second Amendment right or First Amendment right. That's wrong verbiage. It places the origin of that right in a document.
Mm-hmm.
That document enumerates that right. It recognizes that right. It does not create it.
Right. It's a
God
right that's natural.
Right. It is a God-given right that is protected by the Constitution, enumerated in the Constitution, encoded in the Constitution, but it is not a constitutional right. If the listeners take away two things from what I've got to say today, I want it to be that you need to check out my podcast and learn to protect your privacy, and that there is no such animal as a constitutional right. There are God-given rights. They're spelled out in the Constitution. So I'm a post-9/11 patriot. And what I mean by that is I had begun to read some of the writings of the Founding Fathers, but I was cherry-picking that stuff. I'd never read the Constitution all the way through.
Uh-huh.
I hadn't read the Declaration of Independence since like third grade, and I didn't understand it then. It was just part of a school assignment. So then 9/11 happened, and, 9/11 was bad enough, but it was the reaction after 9/11 that was the worst. I I began to see cameras popping up on street corners, and then we got the Department of Homeland Defense, and we got the Patriot Act, and I just became really concerned about what I saw happening. And I had voted for George W. Bush in 2000, so I felt personally betrayed. I remember the pregnant Chads and the hanging Chads and bated breath and waiting to find out who the president was, and waking up the next morning and still not knowing. And
right.
I actually had 2 editions. We were living in Columbus, Ohio at the time. I had 2 editions of the Columbus newspaper. One that said that Bush won, and one that said that Al Gore won.
No way.
Because I had that. I lost it in a move. I don't know what happened. The box got left behind or whatever. But they actually printed both editions of that newspaper, and both of those wound up on my door.
Well, and both of them were correct for a while.
Yeah, nobody knew. Nobody
Right.
knew. And then I remember just the relief. Oh, thank God, George Bush is president. And then here I am just a few months later, it's after September 11th, it's October, it's November, and I'm watching all this stuff happen, and I'm thinking, I'm glad it's not Al Gore, but I'm no longer glad that it's Bush.
Right.
Because the Constitution has to matter. Because by this point, I started actually reading the Constitution, and I read the writings of the Founding Fathers. Like, I just drilled down.
Well,
and I read...
I'm just not to interrupt again, but I'm just curious, what was it 9/11 that got you interested in reading the Constitution more closely, or was there something else that happened in the interim?
No. It was 9/11.
Okay.
It was 9/11 because I should say it was the aftermath of 9/11. It was 10:04 and 11:03 and
right.
12:07. It was the days and weeks and months after that when I was watching a police state form in what had been a free country, right?
Yes.
And I'm watching the surveillance state. Now, in my mind, I'm watching the surveillance state emerge. What I realize now is that I was watching the surveillance state come out into the light a little bit. It had been around since World War II in one form or another, and it had been growing. I'll tell you what, I won't get into it, but your listeners should do a quick internet search for Five Eyes. It's spelled out Fiveeyes, 5 Eyes. Look at who the Five Eyes nations are and what that comes from and where it is. It's surveillance apparatus put in place during and in the aftermath of World War II. And there are 5 nations that share that data with each other. The United States is one of those 5 nations. Oddly, like the tiny little, like New Zealand is one of the.
Wow.
Yes, New Zealand. So it's really, really, really odd. But so I began to sort of realize all of this, and I did what you do if you're 30-ish years old, and suddenly realizing that you live in the Matrix.
Right.
I started filling my basement full of beans and bullets. And I bought some BDUs, and I, was going to be this prepper guy. And fortunately, I had a realization that this is not how to fight this. There's no real solution here, because what do I think my SKS is going to do to an F-16? I won't so much as scratch the paint when my house ceases to exist. And then, while my neighbors roast marshmallows over the burning embers of myself, my wife, and my children while singing Kumbaya or, some war tune because they were told that we were domestic terrorists. So not the answer. Right?
Yeah.
So what is the answer? And then I had come across an issue of the New American magazine, and I write for the New American now. It's an adjunct of the John Birch Society. So I eventually wound up sending off for a subscription to the New American, and got a call from a great guy. His name is Michael Smart. He lives here in the Richmond, Virginia area where I live. And he was the field coordinator at the time, still is. And he called me, and he, I've been reading the New American for a few weeks, and he asked the question that I had been waiting to hear without even realizing I was waiting to hear it. And his question was, Mitch, you've been reading the New American for a while. You're reading about the problem. Would you like to hear about the solution? And I said,
please?
Yeah. So very much. And so we got together for a cup of coffee. A few days later, I wound up joining the John Birch Society. And then they asked me to start a new chapter. So I became a volunteer chapter leader, started a chapter. A year later, there was a staff position that came available, and they offered me that staff position. I moved my family out to Texas. And I was the field coordinator out there for a number of years in North and West Texas, all of Oklahoma, and one little sliver of Arkansas. It was a wonderful time, helping sort of you don't create patriots, but you can wake them up and inform them. Right. So that's what I was doing. And building chapters and sort of building the organization. And then they had told me when I came on staff that if ever a position came available in this area, that they would keep me in mind for that. So sure enough, they were good to their word. They called and said, "Hey, Mitch, we need a coordinator for Virginia and North Carolina. Would you be interested?" Like, yeah, absolutely. I want to get back to near family and friends. Yeah, let's do that. So the guy that had been my boss, Michael Smart, had been my regional field director. So he had been a coordinator here, but he got promoted to regional field director and was my boss by this point. So that left this place open. So I came back out here, and Mike was my boss, and largely instrumental in helping me come on staff with the society, and just a great guy. And so moved back to the East Coast, and this is about the time of the Snowden revelation. So my conversation that I mentioned earlier with my wife and the Gmail thing and roses, that had been before this. That was when we were out in Texas. And so I had begun to sort of drill down and figure out what I could do to regain some of the privacy and liberty that was being lost. And that's when I realized, like, okay, there's more to this, and I'm not crazy. Like, Ed Snowden the other shoe just finally dropped. And here are the documents. Here's the evidence. Here's the proof. So people can quit accusing me of wearing a tinfoil hat and all that stuff. They are spying on us. Like, it's actually happening. Here are government documents to prove it. And that give us a look at how they do it, the mechanisms by which they do it, so that we can formulate real responses. And this is when people began encrypting everything. Like iOS came out with encryption, and Google followed right after that by encrypting the Android operating system. And then I made a switch over to the Linux operating system for my computers and just began digging down. And if you don't know what Linux is, that's okay. When you listen to my podcast long enough, you'll figure it out.
Right.
But I just began, so as an outgrowth of both being a husband and a father and being a patriot, I just came to realize that, like, liberty lost is maybe not never regained, but you can slide into a situation that you have to arduously climb your way back out of.
Yeah.
Right? It's like somebody said about socialism. The problem with socialism is that you can vote your way into it, but you have to shoot your way out. This is similar to that philosophically, and I'm not advocating violence. I hope nobody misunderstands what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's easier to get into a bad situation than it is to get out of it. So we've got to scramble uphill to get out of the ditch that we've allowed ourselves to slide into. And I just realized that for me and mine, it was time to do that. So I've spent most of the last several years reading, listening to, and watching pretty much everything I could get my hands on about how to do that. And then about that time, there were some transitions within the John Birch Society, and they had to let a handful of people go just because of budgetary things. And finally, my number came up, and I didn't leave on bad terms. They just stopped paying me. So, and then I had this dilemma. I am a prematurely graying, pear-shaped, heterosexual white male living in the United States, and the biggest thing on my resume is the John Birch Society.
That's a resume for
sort of equates to unemployable, right? Like that first year that I was not on staff with JBS, I put in 500 resumes, all for jobs that I was qualified for. I looked at the list of like the job description, and I looked at my resume, and they were like, they had copied my resume. So I was like, oh, this is 500. I got one interview and no offers. So I just decided, like, oh, then I have to do something different. And back to my good friend Michael Smart, so some of the local members had sort of started hiring me to do on the side some of the things that I had been doing as a coordinator. Like, hey, Mitch, we've got this big thing coming up about the idea of a modern day constitutional convention. We'd love you to come and speak to this group of legislators or this Tea Party or whoever, and we'll pay you to do that. So like I was sort of ad hocing that stuff, sort of freelancing. Right. And somebody had recorded one of those presentations, put it up on YouTube, and my friend Mike Smart calls me up and he goes, hey, Mitch, man, like, I know we worked together for a while, and I always knew you were a pretty good communicator, but dang, bro, that was good. I was like, oh, well, Mike, I appreciate that. He's like, have you ever done any writing? Oh, Mike, the longest thing I've written since my English 102 term paper is a note on Facebook. He said, well, why don't you think about writing for the New American? I was like, I'm kind of dumb, and I should have thought of that myself. So I stopped and I thought, what can I write about? Like, this is unsolicited. I'm just going to send them an article and see what they think of it, right?
Right.
I mean, not like I don't know them, but nonetheless, it is an unsolicited article. So if I just pick something in the news that everybody else is writing about, then it doesn't stand out. So I know what? I'll write about surveillance.
There you go.
So my first article that I wrote, and it's up on the website still, all these years later, was this very long treatise on pretty much this conversation, like why surveillance matters and what you can do about it, right? And I sent it in, and I heard back from the editor, Gary Benoit. He called me, and he said, hey, Mitch, I just read your article, and I like it, but two things. One, it's way long for an online article. No one's going to read anything that long online. And then two, you address both why and how. So why don't you take the article back, carve it off into two distinct articles, one on how,
right,
and send me that. And then I'll publish that. And then we'll give that a couple of days to get some traction. And then you send me back the why article, like why does it even matter? And then we'll publish that one. And I've been writing for them ever since. I freelance. I'm not on staff. I write for the New American magazine. And if your readers aren't familiar with it, it's a wonderful magazine. They really ought to check it out. It is news analysis from a constitutionalist perspective. The tagline is that freedom not perish.
Yeah.
So there's that.
It is a great magazine. In fact, it was through another writer, Joey Wolverton, that I met you, and who has his own podcast. And it is really smart, really well thought articles. Something you should check out. Again, we're talking to C. Mitchell Shaw, the host of the Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. One of the things you mentioned as we were going through first of all, and as everybody can hear, Mitch is just an amazing storyteller. So you got to check out his podcast and hear how he is able to frame and tell a story, a compelling story that is important and is really relevant to our daily lives. And I think you mentioned how easy it is to fall into a pit and how hard it is to dig out. And I think one of the major ways that we dig out of problems is, number one, education. People are so ignorant of what's going on, and that is where the Snowden thing was just huge. Because I always feel this way, like even with the Epstein thing earlier, and all these things that all of a sudden pop out of existence. It's like, but we already knew all of it. We already knew that people are slime balls. We already knew that this guy was a slime ball. We already knew that the government is doing things. And before, when we talked about, I know you mentioned, stalkers and people who have bad intent. But one of the things that I don't think people realize is that the government is not our friend, and that the government is not there to, it's there for its own protection, not for your protection. And so I think that one of the ways that we dig ourselves out is, number one, education. You're definitely doing that with our podcast. And then number two, making it very difficult for them to do the surveillance. At some point, in a theoretical universe, if everybody is using VPNs, if everybody is doing a few things, it becomes cost prohibitive for the government to become the surveillance state. In other words, it's a silent way for the people to rise up against the tyranny of surveillance.
Yeah, we don't have to take pickaxes and hammers and staves and torches and burn the surveillance state to the ground literally. We can just burn the surveillance state to the ground figuratively by opting out. And so you're getting into something that I haven't even addressed yet on my podcast. And it is this: when enough of us do this, before there to be a surveillance state, it pretty much has to be universal, right?
Right.
They can't surveil everybody unless they're surveilling everybody. It's enough of everybody, and it doesn't even mean everybody. Because look, let me tell you, there are people out there that will gladly exchange their birthright of liberty and privacy for the lentil soup of convenience. or coffee.
Right.
I'll tell you just a brief story to illustrate that. So my youngest daughter, who's now away at college, and she's a wonderful young lady. She, years ago, she was probably 15, 16 years old. She used Bing as her search engine of choice. And it would drive me crazy because Bing is owned and operated by Microsoft. And Microsoft is simply harvesting all your data. It's really just that simple. The whole reason that the Microsoft operating system as it exists now, the Windows, exists, is to harvest your data. And all of their services are designed that way. And that's spelled out very clearly, by the way, in their terms of service. If you read that, if you print it, it's 110 pages and it's 40 some odd thousand words, but read it, read some of it, scan it, find articles on it. I've written about it. They flat out say that they own your data. What pictures, videos, documents, if it's on your computer and it's on their operating system, they own it. And you click, I agree. So it would drive me crazy. She was using Bing, right? And I said, sweetheart, right, why do you use Bing? And she said, oh, Dad, because for every search that I do, I get points. And then they add those points up, and at the end of the month, I get, I can convert those points over into gift cards, and I get a Starbucks gift card, and I get coffee. And I said, you are trading your birthright of privacy for a cup of coffee. I'll tell you what, sweetheart, you use DuckDuckGo as your search engine, and I'll buy your coffee.
That's a good dad there.
Right? And she does now. And she switched over to Linux for her laptop years ago because the Windows 10 thing really threw everybody for a loop. And if y'all don't remember this is when Windows transitioned between Windows 7 and 8 to Windows 10 and baked in all of this just outright spyware. The entire operating system now is designed as spyware. And they got caught doing this. And they deny it. But their denial sounds like, no, trust us. Well, prove it. Oh, just trust us. It's good. Oh, it's good. Oh, something shiny's over there, and there's no, it's happening. Point blank, computer analysts have shown Windows dialing home, calling back, and narking your data out to them. There have been reports of people that had a version of software on their computer that Microsoft could not verify. And I don't even mean Windows Microsoft software. I mean, I've got a video game that I play all the time, and then one day I boot up my computer and that game is gone.
Right.
Because Microsoft deleted it off my computer because they could not confirm that I had a license to use that.
Wow.
So once all that started happening, she came back to me. She's like, hey, Dad, if you've got time, can you put Linux on my computer? I dropped what I was doing.
Right.
I was like, oh, baby, why don't you ask me to tell you about my Catholic faith too? Yeah, she's Catholic too, so I'm just saying. But it's there are a handful of things that I really love to do. And in fact, I've got a notebook somewhere with in the back of it, I've got a bunch of Windows stickers because if you come to me and say, hey, Mitch, will you put Linux on my laptop? I say, oh yeah, and the only thing it'll cost you is that sticker right there.
That's right.
That's the notch on my gun belt, right?
That's beautiful.
That goes in the back of my Ubuntu Linux notebook to show how many Windows laptops I've destroyed and then raised from the dead.
Exactly. Resurrected the laptop, made people owners of their own computers again.
Exactly. Because, you said something earlier, and we're getting kind of a skew here, but that's okay. It's a long form narration.
That's all right.
So we're allowed to do that. You said something earlier about your computer that you allegedly own. And I will say it is only alleged. If you're running Windows on your computer or you're running Mac on your computer, you might own the hardware. You do not own the operating system. You own a license to use the operating system.
Not if it's an Apple computer, because they won't let you fix it.
Well, see, and that's where we get into the right to fix, which is a big deal right now with people, manufacturers denying you the right. So did I or did I not purchase this? Do I or do I not own this? The answer is both yes and no. But where the software is concerned, unless you're running open source software, the answer is no. You do not own your operating system. You do not own that video game. You don't own that movie.
And again, it's one of those things that we
license
know
to look at that.
Right. And it's one of those things that we know, because when we buy it, what do? We purchase a license. We don't purchase the software. We purchase a license. And that becomes a legal term. That means you don't own it. You're renting it, and you do not have the right to use it as you want.
And they have the right at any point to rescind that.
Yep.
They can exercise the right to say, nope, we're going to kill that, and you can never, ever use it no more. And it's wrong. So what happened was I'd taken some computer classes. I mean, I really am a nerd. And in those computer classes, and this was years before all of this, I was introduced to Linux, and I checked it out, and I liked it. But, I wasn't philosophically there yet. This was right about the same time that I was waking up to the video cameras and all of that stuff. So, I needed to bake a little longer. I wasn't quite done. But now flash forward a few years, I'm on staff with the John Birch Society. We're living out we were in Raleigh at the time. We had moved back to the East Coast. And I had a little netbook, if people remember netbooks, weren't those?
Oh, sure.
But it came with Windows installed on it, and I upgraded to the full version of Windows, and it was supposed to work just fine. And I upgraded the RAM, and it was supposed to work just fine. And I keep saying it was supposed to because it never actually did. And then about every 6 months, I would get a blue screen of death. If you've never had a blue screen of death, God bless you. You are a very fortunate person. This is when your entire screen goes blue and your computer will not respond to anything you do. It's a Windows thing, and it stinks. So about every 6 months, I'd get a BSOD. And I finally just decided I had dealt with the last one. Now, I'm very good about backing up my data. If you're not backing up your data, you may as well just go ahead and delete everything now. If you care about it, back it up. Like, put it on something else and keep it away. So I'm good about that. So, about every 6 months, I would have to reinstall my operating system. And then, of course, now it's weird because the computer came with Windows. I should just be able to put Windows back on it and use it. No. Now I've got to go find the driver for the Wi-Fi card. I've got to find the driver for the keyboard, the driver for the graphics, the driver for the sound card. It's like, wait, why isn't that part of Windows? This is a Windows computer. But no, it doesn't work like that. So I decided I wasn't going to deal with it anymore. I downloaded Ubuntu Linux and installed it on my computer in a dual boot, meaning that when I powered up my machine, it would stop and ask me the question, which operating system do you want? Do you want Windows or Linux? And after about 2 weeks, I realized it's been 2 weeks since I've opened that Windows partition. Why am I giving them half of my real estate?
Right.
I formatted the hard drive, reinstalled Ubuntu, and I have never looked back. That has been, that was before my son was born, and he's 8. So that's been 9 or 10 years now.
Wow.
So initially it was just about like not dealing with the technological issues of Windows and not it. But I very quickly began to realize the philosophy of open source software is the philosophy of liberty. It is the philosophy of freedom. I actually own my operating system. I own every piece of software that I'm running on my computer. I can do anything I want to with it. I can download the source code if I want to and learn how to hack that and make it do something different than the manufacturer intended, and no one cares. The only thing I can't do with open source software is deny you the right to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So if I take a piece of open source software and create my own derivative of it, I can pass that along. I just can't restrict what you do with it.
Yep.
And that's the way it should be.
Absolutely.
And so I real quickly realized, like, this is the operating system for Patriot. This is amazing. And so, yeah, just check it out. I think we've kind of gotten out in the weeds and stuff that's a little more technical than we probably wanted to. But
no, it's fine. I think people need to hear
some part of who I am.
Yeah, and people need to hear alternatives of what they're already doing. We are coming up to the end. So again, we're talking to C. Mitchell Shaw, the host of the Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. And quick, give us maybe 1, 2, or 3, just a few things. Let's say people, they see there's a problem. They're not really ready to upend their lives and change too much. But what are a few simple things that people can do to maybe put a cog in the system, make it a little more difficult for people to surveil them? Okay, so and we'll look at like surface level things, because that's usually where you get the most bang for your buck. Right. It's like a lot of things. Like when I'm doing my podcast, I can record my podcast, and then
there are people that's that. They just post that raw audio and people listen to their podcast. I do a lot of posts. I imagine you do a lot of post editing, cleaning up the sound and making it sound better. But there's a point at which you go, okay, I've spent an hour and I'm 90% of the way there. And I could spend another 5 hours to get the other 10% there, but I'm good. I'm just going to post it. Right?
Right.
So this is like that. What are the simplest things on the surface that listeners could do to kind of secure their data? I would say first thing first, if you are using an internet browser like Microsoft Edge or Microsoft Internet Explorer, stop that. If you are using Google's Chrome, stop that. It is Google Chrome. The first word is Google. The whole reason they give you an operating system is to harvest your data. Download Firefox and do a quick internet search using DuckDuckGo, not Google, by the way. So that's my second thing is change your search engine. If you're Googling things, don't. That is how they harvest so much of what they do. There has to be a way that Google is worth hundreds of billions of dollars giving software and services away.
That's right.
And it is because the software and the services are not their product. Your data is their product. And they give you this software to use so that you will lead your data to them and they can sell it. So don't let them do that. Use DuckDuckGo as your search engine. Install the Firefox browser and then do a DuckDuckGo search for how to better secure that. There are some very simple browser add-ons that people can install in a couple of clicks. They're already configured and they will block a lot of that stuff. My favorite browser is Brave. The Brave browser it's based on the same software that Chrome is based on, but it has none of the Google bit. And he locks down a lot of that other stuff already right from the beginning, the guy that created the Brave browser. So, Firefox or Brave, either one of those would be a great choice for your next browser. DuckDuckGo or StartPage are great search engines that do not track you.
That's huge.
They promise it up front. Their software is open source, so people can actually analyze this themselves and see that truly you are not being monitored. You are not being cataloged and tracked. And then the final thing I would say is just like you think about situational awareness in the three-dimensional world, you need to think about situational awareness in the digital space. Like that teenager who all those years ago out in Texas posted that she was on her way to work. What a bad idea. And somebody who was knowledgeable and loved her could have said, sweetheart, never do that again. Never do that. So be situationally aware and think, this thing that I am posting, this thing that I am sharing, would I want this to be on the front page above the fold of my local newspaper? And if the answer is anything less than I could not care less, don't post it. Yep. Don't say it. Don't do it. Not in a public way. So be situationally aware and then stop and ask yourself this question. If I wanted to surveil me right now in the activity that I am doing on this device, could I do it? Could someone do it? And if the answer is yes, just think about that. Turn off data location on your phone, unless you absolutely need the map to get somewhere, but it needs to be turned off in your camera settings. Go into your camera settings, do an internet search because everyone's a little bit different, depending on which version of Android you're using or whether you're using iOS. But just do a quick search. You'll find a YouTube video that will show you how to do it or something like that. Turn off location settings in your camera and keep location settings turned off in your phone unless you need the map for something right this moment. And those would be the surface level things I would do. And then, of course, check out my podcast, enemyofthesurveillancestate.podbean.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts, because I've made sure it's available on all of the major directories. It's on Stitcher. It's on Spotify. If you're looking for it, you'll find it. It's on iTunes. It's on Google. You'll find it. And check it out because these are the things that we talk about there every week. We talk about both the philosophy of the surveillance state and the tools that are available to help you protect yourself. And I try to keep it simple. I think I told you this before we started recording, Mike. I am bilingual. I speak both geek and human. So I translate. I sort of act as an intermediary between the geek world that understands this stuff and the human world that wishes it understood this stuff.
Right.
So that's what I try to do on my podcast.
And I think we heard that today. I think we heard a little bit of the geek and that translated into human. I think people, I'm grateful for you being on the show today. Again, this is C. Mitchell Shaw, the host of the Enemy of the Surveillance State podcast. You can find him on Podbean. You can find him on Google, wherever you listen to your podcast. Also, he does have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/enemy of surveillance. And I understand that you're getting some digs. You're getting some T-shirts and some wearables with. Is that right?
Yeah. So I had to make a decision early on. I mean, obviously, I may not be a greedy capitalist, Big, but the people that I owe money to for my house every month are, and the people at the grocery store are, and the power company is, and the water company is, and the phone company is, and so sadly, it is what it is. You got to be a little bit mercenary because money does make the world go round.
For sure,
it at least keeps the people I love from starving to death and being exposed to the elements. So I knew I had to find a way to monetize this, and I decided early on that would not be through ads because I want my listeners to know that if I recommend a service or a product, it's probably going to be software because that's the people who are listening to me, right? Like it wouldn't make sense for me to be like, and this ointment is so good. My skin feels so smooth. Like, who cares? That's not why I listen to you, Mitch. Talk to me about what's the next phone I need to buy.
Right.
So if I recommend a phone or a laptop or a piece of software, I want my listeners to know that it is because I believe in it and not because somebody paid me to say that. So how to monetize. And that's why I decided to launch the Patreon account. And it's why I'm launching a line of merch so that people who listen to the show and enjoy the show and want to support the show can.
That's great. Well, if
you're interested, if you listen to my show and you like what you hear, check out my Patreon account, and I set the levels really, really low all the way up to a little bit higher so that, anybody at just about any level that wants to support could. And so that's why I'm doing that.
Right on. Well, thanks again, Mitch. Thanks for being on the show. This is Mike Levitt. You are listening to And If Love Remains. It's the podcast about people. So thank you. And hey, we'll talk. We got to do this again, right?
Absolutely.
All right. It was fun. All right. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.